Our next presenter to discuss peace through social justice advocacy is Mr. Thomas D. Allison, Esquire. Please help me welcome him. I should point out that Thomas and I are both a moment. Hold that against me. We need some audio-visual help here. Yours working?
Good.
Let me take that from you for a second while we're preparing that. Let me tell you a little something about Thomas. Having been licensed and ordained as a deacon in his church as an early teen, Thomas Allison experienced a fall from grace that ultimately brought him to a crossroad. Embarrassed and confused, Thomas knew he had to be different, that he was different. Now an accomplished attorney, licensed in 5 states, owner of his own law practice, founder and president of a nonprofit organization known as Social Justice Advocacy Project Incorporated, Thomas has been published twice and instructs here at the University of Laverne as an adjunct professor and coaches college mock trial and debate. So Thomas, in a moment we're going to hear about your work, and I'm not sure if you'll touch on this, but what inspired you to devote yourself to empowering people and communities? What was the genesis of that?
Well, I was born and raised by a single mother. I grew up in poverty. I've seen poverty all my life, and my family is impoverished. We suffer from intergenerational poverty, and there's been a disdain that I felt toward that my entire life. And then I came here, I'm working on my 4th degree from here, my 2nd doctorate, and I gained enough education to kind of understand some of the pitfalls that lead people into poverty and perpetual poverty. And so I made it my mission to do what I can to devote my training and my education to help bridge the gap for people who grew up or have life experience much like I had, to try and help them see how they might be able to empower themselves into their dreams.
So you lived it and wanted to try and make a difference in the lives of others who were living it as well.
Absolutely.
How do you go about convincing people that they can really make a difference in their own lives and in their community's life, when oftentimes in deep poverty there's a pervasive sense of hopelessness? How do you convince folks that you can actually turn that around?
The good part about being me is that when people from that type of community look at me, they can see themselves in me once they hear my story, right? I sat in a jail right across the street over there at Laverne jail for making a mistake, right? So I'm not exempt from the hands of the criminal justice system, right? So when people understand a bit more of my experience and what I've gone through, and then they see where I am now, they see themselves in that journey. And I think that's what makes me, fairly influential for people who come from communities like the one that I come from.
You really espouse a philosophy of communities identifying and solving problems together. How do you overcome, and as I mentioned a moment ago, I live in Pomona, so I know my town. There's a lot of disparate viewpoints. There's a lot of variety of opinion, differences of opinion about facts, about approaches, about solutions. How do you get all those disparate parties to actually begin to think and work together?
I think we have to understand that they're all right. All right. The problem that we have is because I have a particular ideology or way of thinking, I think that people who don't think like me are wrong. When in reality, we all just have different experiences, right? So if we understand that we can learn just as much from people who disagree with us as we can people who agree with us, then I think we'd all be better off and we'd have a much stronger community. And I think educating people on the interdependence between groups and how we must rely on each other for greater community growth is a priority and must be a priority if we're going to bring that variety of viewpoints together in a common discussion.
Great. Thank you, Thomas Allison. The lectern is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Before I get started, I would like to make some recognitions. I'd like to thank the committee for putting this together. Garbus, thank you for your leadership. I would like to recognize the West Covina Rotary Club, who are not just friends of mine, they are my family. So if we can give them a round of applause, that'd be great. As I mentioned, I've been a student here actually since 2003. I'm working on my dissertation on my second doctorate degree. And I'm grateful for what this university has given me and the community around it. So I'd like to recognize the university as well. Last but not least, I would like to recognize my beautiful bride. Exactly 8 years ago, I proposed to her, and she made what was probably the most foolish decision of her life in saying yes. But she continues to give me family, she continues to give me grace, and she continues to keep me humble. So if we could give a round of applause. Let's get something straight. America is great. And America is great because of the ideologies that make us uniquely American. But America has not reached the full capacity of its greatness. The only way America is going to be able to reach the full capacity of its greatness is if it starts to match more its action with its words. And Dr. King considered the words of the American Foundation to be a promissory note. And so I'm going to start off by kind of talking about some of the promises that the U.S. government has made to its citizens, and then we're going to kind of shift into how that works and translate into various actions toward typical or different communities. I'm going to let you know a secret. I'm a black man, okay? So much of my presentation is going to be dealing with the black community and my experience as a black man. That is not to say that other groups don't suffer the same type of discrimination that I'm going to get into today. But I'm going to speak from a lens from which I have personal experience. And I hope that I will challenge some of the ideas that you have about what makes us great as a nation and what roads we can take to become a greater nation, the greatest nation in all of history. So, first, we're going to start with the Declaration of Independence. If you can see it, read along with me. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute a new government. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. Finally, that's the 14th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And as observed by Dr. King, these words construct a promissory note. However, insofar as her citizens of color are concerned, the U.S. government
stands in default of this promissory note. How does it stand in default? There are a few examples I'd like to share. First, the issue of extrajudicial killings. 3/4 of individuals who were lynched were black. 55% of individuals who are involved in police-involved shootings are black. However, black individuals are less likely to be armed with a weapon or just as likely to be armed with a gun as our white counterparts. However, more than half of the bullets used by law enforcement are aimed toward black bodies. Mass incarceration. 1 in 3 individuals, black individuals, through their lifetime can expect to be incarcerated. Compared to their white counterparts, 1 in 17 men can expect to see incarceration throughout their lives. Finally, when we talk about voter disenfranchisement, 1/3 of individuals who've lost their right to vote are black, despite the fact that black individuals only make up about 12% of our population. Right? I told you I was going to challenge some things that you've probably been thinking about. Right? So we're in default as far as black citizens are concerned. Well, when we look at the recourse of what happens in that default, we recognize that the history of the U.S. has pitted law enforcement against the black community. Right? From the very beginning of the U.S. existence, actually it started in 1619, we had an institution called slavery. That institution bled into convict leasing, which bled into Jim Crow, which bled into mass incarceration. There's not been a single period in U.S. existence where black individuals were not disproportionately impacted by the law. Well, when we ask ourselves, what does equal protection actually mean? We have to be concerned about this disproportionality. Well, if we look at the relationship that law enforcement has had in those policies, then we understand why there's such a fundamental distrust between the black community and law enforcement, right? Law enforcement started as slave patrols. Their sole function was to keep slaves in line or to catch runaway slaves. That was their only role when they started, right? So then they move on to convict leasing, and their role in convict leasing, mass incarceration, all of this start with the reps out in the field, right? So law enforcement is a part, that's actually the face of the discrimination as far as the black community is concerned. And this has caused quite a disdain between the communities. My question is, how or should we work to make this better? And of course, I think the answer to the should question is yes. The answer to the how question, I'm going to try and provide that for you. So why should we talk? The problem is much deeper than black individuals versus the police, right? Because the police are just enforcing the law, right? And in fact, I've sat down with dozens of police officers in order to do this research, and I found that I have more in common with police officers than I don't have in common with police officers. At the end of the day, we want to live in a safe community. We want to live in a peaceful community. We want to go home to the families that we love. We want to see the world, right? These are all experiences that we share as humans. And police officers, just as black individuals, are not exempt from these same desires. So if we have the same root desires, then why is it that we have such a hard time coming to commonality with how we can reach those desires together? Well, that problem is we're not talking, right? And the question is, will talking actually work? I'm going to argue that it will. Talking reduces collateral damage. As I said, many black individuals and law enforcement have the same desires in mind. If law enforcement wants to make it home at the end of the day, so does the black individual. And recognizing that empathy, I think, will get more understanding. Actually, that's my next point, so I'll just go ahead and pop that up there. Right? We'll get more understanding, and those situations will allow for individuals to have greater understanding, great relationships. In fact, I think it was said earlier, you have a hard time critiquing somebody that you have a relationship with. Well, I'd imagine you probably have a really hard time shooting that person as well. Right? So if we start developing relationships, then we'll probably start seeing a lot less of the violence, because it's hard to enact violence against somebody you are in relationship with. Right? So the foundation of this discussion is the establishment of relationships. The result of these relationships become greater public safety for everybody, because as I said, we all want to live in safe communities. We all want to go to work, we all want to go home, we all want to pray in ways in which are going to forward our humanity, not deprive us of it. And I think if we also talk more things out, we're able to pinpoint how we can actually make some of the systemic changes that causes a rift between our communities and the individuals that compose it. So, how do we get such a conversation started? Well, it starts with meetings, right? And I'm not going to make this seem easier. Okay, that's just going to do it once. I'm not going to make this seem easier than it is, right? This is going to take stakeholders from both sides coming together and saying something needs to change. And they're going to have to make that phone call to the other side and say, can we sit down and have a discussion? And I'm not going to trivialize this process. It's incredibly hard, it's incredibly difficult, right? I went through this process, and in fact, it took 3 nights of consecutive nightmares to motivate me to finally ask my wife, who's the vice president of this project, to give the nearest police chief a call, which was Chief Pickwick right here in Laverne, right? So that first meeting is very important, but we have to have the bravery, right? We have to be able to step outside of our vulnerability to call that meeting and to conduct it. From those meetings, the empathy, the education that can be gained and learned will create a system of trust. And in that system of trust, we can ask for things. And one of my asks to other police chiefs were, can they participate in the Truth and Reconciliation program? Why do we want a Truth and Reconciliation program? Because people are not listening to each other, right? And so we have to not only be willing to talk and have our voice be heard, but we have to also be willing to listen and to be willing to accept what that other side is willing to say. And the only process I know that situates parties to be able to do that is the Truth and Reconciliation process. From that, we can gain partnerships, and from those partnerships, we gain reform. So my nonprofit is called the Social Justice Advocacy Project. Our mission is to provide empowerment tools to disenfranchised individuals for better self-determination. What that means practically, we do a lot of pro bono legal clinics. Literally every week, we are providing free legal services and free legal advice to members of the community. But what we also do is we create safe spaces in communities where people are striving to better themselves, right? Particularly disenfranchised individuals, the poor, minorities. So, a couple years ago, an individual named Philando Castile was killed. And I always tell the people that I mentor that it's not ever worth it to fight police in the street, right? They got tanks, they got guns, sometimes they have bombs, right? They have a lot of cool stuff that we don't even know they have. They are guaranteed to win that fight, right? So take the ride and we'll take the fight to the courtroom. But what happens when people are afraid that they won't make it to the courtroom? And Philando Castile's death sparked fear in my own mind. I live in a region that is composed of about 6 to 8% black individuals. I don't feel like I'm at home. I don't look around and see people who look like me and therefore feel safe, right? So I needed to understand, what are police thinking about people like me? What is my police chief thinking about people like me? And what does his rank and file think about people like me? So I reached out, or actually have my wife reach out to the chief, right? Because I understand that in militaristic structures, there's a strong chain of command. If an order is given from the top, it will be followed throughout the ranks because that's the way that they're structured, right? So if I understand the thinking of the police chief, then I'm probably able to understand a little bit better the culture of that particular department. And so my wife reached out to Laverne, right? But when I started those meetings, I didn't go to the meeting saying, hey chief, here's a problem that I have with what you're doing. Here's how I think you're doing your job poorly, right? I didn't go there to criticize him. I went there because I needed to learn. It's hard to criticize something that you don't fully understand, right? So the point of that meeting was simple understanding. And because that was the way that I took on that meeting, it snowballed such that anytime I placed a phone call, I was able to get a meeting with the chief from that particular department. And in fact, the California Highway Patrol, after hearing about the work we were doing, reached out to me and asked me to come meet with them and their chiefs and their higher ranking officers in order to have the same discussion that I was having with local law enforcement. So what I saw wasn't a reluctance to participate, I actually saw a willingness to participate. However, that willingness only came because of the context in which the ask was being made. A context of wanting to understand, not a context of criticism and ridicule. So I cover this entire region except for Charter Oak, right? So every single police department in this region, I wanted to understand. Why? Because my West Covina Rotary Club is in West Covina. My law office at the time was in West Covina. I had an office in Pomona. I work here in the University of Laverne. I live in Laverne. I travel through all these cities on a daily basis. I need to know not only that I'm safe in this city, I need to know that I'm safe in the region, right? The places where I work, play, right? So I talked to the leadership in this entire region in order to gain better understanding of what was going on. So here's some of the pictures. The meeting that I have with the Azusa Police Department, most of these meetings were about an hour long, right? I sat with Chief Hunt from Azusa for about 3 hours because we were genuinely interested in learning from each other. And as I stated, I didn't have issues getting meetings with these individuals. We can talk about this later in the panel. I want to make sure I'm good on time. At the meeting, I presented a 15-point platform, right? Because I'm not just there to ask questions. I also want to present some of my ideas. Right, so I typed it up in 15 points that I thought would be a good conversation starter. And I asked the police chiefs about their opinions on each and every last one of these things. Finally, I asked them to participate in the Truth and Reconciliation process. The reason I wanted them to participate in the Truth and Reconciliation process is because I had done research on Truth and Reconciliation and its usage in other countries. And that usage ended up being what ends the apartheid, what helps Panama work toward some of the justice questions that they have. Even Canada, and the way that they were treating their Aborigines residents, discrimination all over the world, Truth and Reconciliation seemed to be the mechanism to bring these groups to truth. The process itself is concerned with fact-finding and peace generation. We're not concerned with retribution and who's going to go to jail. We're concerned about coming together and mending the wounds that several of us experience that prevent us from working together and our communities from progressing. So in the local application, I used the 9 agencies that were interested and that gave me their commitment to participate. And we did 2 Truth and Reconciliation programs. We did 2 of them, and in fact, we're planning a 3rd one, because every single time we do one, I learn a little bit more about the people involved. I learn a little bit more about how I can engage people a little better. I learn a little bit more about how I can make this program more effective. And I think if we can get a critical mass of individuals to participate in the Truth and Reconciliation process, we will see legitimate change. So the first Truth and Reconciliation process, both of them took place in Pomona. It started with the general Q&A that was asked to the panel police chief, right? I wanted to create a baseline of information that the entire room was operating on, right? So there are no assumptions, and if there all are assumptions, then those assumptions are ready to be challenged based on information and statistics. Individuals from the audience were permitted to speak for 2 minutes to provide their truths. Law enforcement was not required to respond to each truth, and in fact, gave a statement of reconciliation at the end that permitted them to respond to various issues that they heard throughout the truth process. The second Truth and Reconciliation involved a process called collaborative rationality. Now, authors Innes and Bohr have this structure of how it was mentioned earlier. There has to be equality between groups if we expect for these groups to actually come together and discuss change, right? So Innocent Board creates this model that the best way to get groups to feel equal is to put them face to face against each other, to provide basic information to them. Make sure everybody is on the same informational page. So, and everybody has equal time to talk. So law enforcement had the same amount of time to talk as the private residents, right? Both sides had equality throughout the entire process. We brought together more than 40 businesses, nonprofits, and public agencies in order to create a diversity of representation to ensure that we had major groups at the table for this particular program. And so the result of it, surveys suggest that more than 90% of individuals who went through this process actually reported gaining better understanding of the other individual. They also report better understanding of the role of collaboration and partnership and how that in and of itself could be a tool for healing the community. Finally, more than 89% of individuals who completed the survey responded that they are more inclined to engage with the other side for positive programming, which means that partnership that I was working toward, that I wanted to build up, was in fact becoming a reality. And there in fact were several partnerships and relationships that were created by various organizations that were previously anti-police that ended up working with police in order to make better policies. So some of the partnership opportunities that become available as a result of this process, you have guest speakers and panels, youth programs, you have to change the mind of the youth. We heard that from Dr. Lee earlier, right? Program collaborations and most of all, relationships. And what this program has resulted in is my nonprofit conducting more than 20 community programs with various law enforcement agencies throughout the region. Right, and in this picture, it's unfortunate you can't actually see the picture, but there's that ring of students are students from this particular university, and it's taking place right across the street in the EOC, the command center for the fire department, right? And the reason we actually had this program was because at Truth and Reconciliation 1, we had University of Laverne students share, I live and go to school literally right across the street from the police department. And that doesn't make me feel safer. It makes me feel more in danger, right? So when Don Kendrick talked earlier, the mayor of this city, I spoke to him, and I spoke to Chief Pickwick, and I said, you heard these realities, what can we do about it, right? So we hosted a program called Peace, Police, and Pizza. Everybody likes pizza, right? So we got the students to come together, we gave them free pizza, and they were able to talk. But what's remarkable about this photo, if you're able to see it, only one police officer is wearing their uniform. Right, and that particular person was serving as the watch commander at that particular time, so he kind of had to be in uniform, right? Nobody else was in uniform, and the reason is, when I talked to Laverne students, they reported to me that I don't want to meet with police with them wearing their badges and their guns, right? That causes me more fear than it does comfort, okay? So I asked the police chief, if we're going to have a program, can you guys leave your badges and guns, or at least hide them, so that they can't see them? Right? And you have the chief of Laverne Police sitting there. He's like right there. Oh, wait. He's right there wearing a polo and blue jeans. Right? And every other police officer is dressed about the same. And this is what helped them have honest discussion. I have Chief Hunt come every semester to talk to my trial advocacy class about youth supports. Because in order to critique something, you have to understand it. I bring Lieutenant Vasquez from Pomona PD several times in order to talk to my students as a minority police officer. What are some of the challenges that minority police officers are facing that might be able to have them act as allies for non-police minority within their ranks? Every year, every term, we hold a Meet the Chief program. Chief Paulus has participated the last 3 years in this program. This allows for faculty and staff to come together with the mayor and the police chief and ask questions about their city and how their city's been administered, right? It's a justice question. If you have access to the people who are forming policy, then you feel that equality, you feel a voice, and you have more of a reason to engage. But if there's a cycling of that relationship, then you don't come forward, and in fact, you just only perpetuate the hate that is driving much of our emotions today. And then I've been invited for the past 2 years to participate in police chief executive leadership training. And what this is officers from the rank of lieutenant all the way up to chief throughout the entire state of California goes to the Claremont colleges and sit and listen to us tell them and educate them on the issues of the black community. Well, one of the most profound experiences that I had during this program was I had a police chief from a majority white community say, I don't have access to minorities, but I have a big question. What is wrong with the slogan, "Make America Great Again"? And I looked at him because I wasn't sure if he was actually genuine with this question, and he was. So I said, sir, I want you to put yourself in my shoes for a second. You're a black man. Now point in history to a place where you would want to live more than now, or a time you would want to live more than now. And he thought about that. And he says, there's no point in history where I'd want to live as a black man. Exactly. If you're talking about again, that means you're going back, right? There's nothing good for us back. We need to keep moving forward. And that police chief swore to me at that very moment that he would never wear the Make America Great Again hat. And I'm not judging anybody who wears a hat. I'm not judging any Trump individual. This is not a political discussion. The point is, when people are educated, they gain empathy. And when they gain empathy, they gain understanding. And that understanding causes them to modify their behavior, right? And that's what the process is about. And the final example I'll share is a criminal justice panel that we did. We invited the Claremont Chief Vanderveen to participate in this program. And we had a public defender as well as district attorney show up to answer questions from individuals in the community. And this is at a Black Intersection Committee. And at that meeting, we all made the commitment that we were going to work toward a more unified society and community. That is what I consider change. That is what I consider each generation. Azusa Police Department was recognized for their community work by the International Association of Police Chiefs, right? And they invited me to share my platform. So police agencies all over the world have heard about this type of program, and in fact, many of them are engaged. I called the Ferguson Police Department, and I told him the program that we have going on in this particular region, right? He offered to fly me out to Ferguson to have a discussion about implementing the same type of thing in Ferguson, Missouri, right? So I believe that there's a willingness to participate. The question is, how do we get the right people at the table? And that comes into challenges, right? There are several challenges to this, including double consciousness. W.E.B. Du Bois talks about this, right? There's a two-ness that is experienced from a successful black individual, right? You still feel the boot on the back of your neck, but at the same time, you're having lunch and being in positions of power with individuals who control that boot, right? So that double consciousness causes me to concern myself as to whether or not I'm actually selling out my community by having these discussions, right? So this has not been an easy process, and I'm not going to tell you it's an easy process. In fact, it's been humiliating at points, because in order to be the moderate nowadays, in our hate-filled time, you become the new extremist, right? Everybody is comfortable hearing, hate them, dislike them, let's burn this place down. That makes people feel comfortable. They resonate with that. But when I say, let's talk to the people that you consider your oppressors, right? I become a traitor. And that's on both sides, right? The police are just as skeptical of me as the black community is. Because nobody talks about moderation nowadays. Everybody wants to go to the side of extremism. There are political limitations, right? The DA has to approve a lot of policies that need to be changed. They have to be at the table. The city council has a role in this. The mayor, all of these groups have some sort of power, but not complete power. So it makes it hard to create a overall change with any particular group. So all of the groups must be brought to the table, which becomes incredibly difficult to do, and there needs to be tangible outcome. If you're going to want both communities to do something like this, then they have to understand that it's not going to be a waste of their time. Can this apply in the United States? This is my last slide. I think it can. Right? If the Department of Justice mandated all local law enforcement to participate in a program like this, and they tied funding to their participation, they would do it. And I think meaningful doesn't need to be judged by the people who are putting on the program, i.e. the people who have the financial interest, but meaningful needs to be judged by the community themselves. Did I get something from this? Was this actually meaningful? Was I actually heard? Were the people of power actually giving me the equality that we need for a process like this to actually work? No criminal prosecution. The system needs to take full responsibility for what it has done to us, right? The human lives that are lost, the black lives that are lost every single day. Right? The system has to take responsibility for that. But the system also has to take responsibility for the cops, the lives that are lost on the police side. Right? Violence on both sides is created by a lacking of education. And I think that lacking of education is perpetuated through many policies that this country has that needs to be revisited. Finally, and I know this is really unpopular, right? But there does need to be meaningful reparations. And one cheap reparation that I can consider or think of is closing the loophole in the 13th Amendment. The government should have no right to make anybody a slave, right? Whether you're in prison or not. When you make somebody a slave, you automatically diminish their humanity. And there's no diminishment of humanity if we're going to talk about peace, right? It was actually said by Garvers very eloquently earlier. In peace, there's justice, and in justice, there is peace. Without justice, there is no peace. So any diminution of human value is an injustice, and that injustice becomes a threat to justice everywhere. So ladies and gentlemen, we can talk about peace, but we also need to talk about mechanisms toward creating that peace. And not only do we need to talk about these mechanisms, we have to be willing and bold enough to engage in them and actively participate. Thank you.
Well said. We'll invite all of our speakers to come forward and join us for a panel discussion. We have some questions from the audience, and I'm looking forward to hearing what everybody has to say. So please, come on up and make yourselves comfortable. So this may sound like a self-serving question coming from a Rotarian, but what's the role of civic organizations in peace building? Do you have some advice for us here? What do you think we can do as Rotarians and as members of other civic organizations?
You're doing it. This is it. I mean, this is an extraordinary group of people, and it's an extraordinary audience, and having all of the students here, I'd say you get however many gold stars everybody hands out, you get them all.
I would also add that we do our own work. I always say to people, if they say they don't judge people, I say, really? We've all been taught to judge. We've all learned the lies and conditioning. So for us individually, just to be honest and humble about it, and then do our own work on unlearning racism, sexism, homophobia, and all the ways we separate and divide. And that takes vulnerability, so that scares a lot of people. And we've been given paths from many people today on how to do
that. We need leadership, right? And people aggregate into groups. We all have these group identities, right? And civic organizations stand in a great position to educate their membership on people who are not like them, right? So what I would say is for Rotary, right? Service above self. If our goal is to feed hunger or end hunger, we need the hungry at the table with us, right? We don't need to come and sit within our groups and decide what is best for these individuals without inviting these individuals to have a place at the table, right? So what I would say is, it should be the goal of civic organizations to educate its membership beyond their particular mission and get out into the community and understand the actual implications of that mission on the greater community.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Sometimes I get a little bit very frustrated with the Rotary Club. I'm not saying that we are not doing a lot. We are doing a lot. But I get frustrated in the sense that we just want to take services, or we decide what we can take there. We decide what to do there. Like he said, we need to involve the community. We need to involve the recipients. That way it can be more effective. And education is very important. It could be, I just want us to go and provide some medical facilities or some walking crutches to this community because they have this need. It could be possible. They may not even be needing that. They may be needing something different. And you did not collaborate with them to know what they need in that place. So I think collaboration is very, very important, that organizations try to collaborate with people before you can give them the services.
Thank you all. Thank you. Yes, Dr. Luke?
Yeah, so I also asked about what can Rotary do for something at the macro level, say the North Korean thing, what can regular people do, right? So I do think public opinion matters in a democracy, and an informed public opinion is critical. So that means getting educated on issues for two reasons. One is so you don't respond negatively when there's misinformation or fake news, because a lot of the noise that's out there that makes it difficult for politicians to act is when people are not informed. Secondly, converting that into going and voting. And there's this one theory I really like. It's by Robert Putnam, and it's about civil society, and that's what makes democracy strong. I mean, it's the institutions, but it's actually regular folk in institutions such as this connecting and conversing at the face-to-face level, so you can build strong communities there. So one thing to do also is get rid of Facebook and social media, or use it less, so you're connecting people, in a tactile way as opposed to just digitally, because that's where misinformation can spread quickest.
Our differences, racial, cultural, social, economic, are often deep-seated and very intractable. But probably the most intractable differences of all are religious differences. How do we begin to break that down? How do we begin to get someone who's had a long-held spiritual belief, as our poet described earlier, that women have a certain role, for example, or whatever it might be, that we find ourselves in conflict with? How do we begin to change? How do we begin to have that conversation?
Just in the work that we do, so much comes from empathy, and there's many activities. One of the ones we use is an activity called Cross the Line, where it's done nonverbal except for the person who's leading it, and it brings up issues. We use it as a tool to look at social oppression. Cross the line if you're a woman, cross the line if you're Black of African heritage, there are all the cultures, cross the line. If you or any family members ever been poor, cross the line if you ever been put down or hurt for your religious or spiritual. So what happens in that is to see the people who, from the other side, looking back, human beings, the compassion, the empathy starts to rise, and and the awareness in a way that comes from the heart is the tool we use. So it's from you're another human being, and I can see the pain in your eyes. Therefore, now I have empathy and compassion. Let's sit down and talk. That's 1, 2.
I also raised this issue during my presentation, the difference. We need to check about what worked before and what is happening now. What happened before when there were no issues, when there was no problem, and why is there a problem now? We find that when we begin to respect, which we all say in our presentations, we need that respect. It's because some other groups will think I'm better than this person or I'm better than this group. That's when problems start. So we need to respect one another. When we have that attitude of respect, I think we are going to go a long way. And then the attitude of not being biased, non-judgmental. We just need to learn from one another and understand where we are coming from. There is nothing bad about me asking you to tell me more about your Islamic religion, and there is nothing bad about you learning from me. I've traveled on our vocational service with the team, and there are times when we just go into the church, they follow me to the church, and we just go have a nice time, and then we come back, all of us, all the team members. So, I mean, if we can begin to respect one another and just begin to put down our differences, I think we can make it a very good, effective effort in peace building. Thank you.
Thank you.
This might be a controversial position, and I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I do think that there are some things that are mutually exclusive, right? So if that's a religion or an ideology or something that says, say, women fundamentally don't have rights, as opposed to they do, there's no compromise on that position, right? Like ultimately there are some standards that people have to stand for, but the politics is how to negotiate and get people to start seeing a different position, because I think it's objectively correct to say that everyone should have rights regardless of their gender or race or things such as that. So that's the part that's hard to navigate, right? That it's true we can acknowledge someone's religion or position and respect them and not look down upon them, but we still have to engage with them in order to change that position, because I think some positions fundamentally should change. And it's hard because we also have other values such as a respect for religion, and that means our values conflict. We don't have a coherent way of living in this world, and that's the politics of it. But I do think that's when we have to put our foot down on some issues.
I'll just add a little brief addition to that. Education. I'm a Christian man, and when I bring that up, it often is received as a taboo, right? Because Christianity throughout this society has seemed to permeate the walls of justice in this very discriminatory manner, right? So I think education is necessary in order to get people to empathize. I have an issue with ignorant Christians, right? When you read about Christ, we're supposed to be Christ-like. But if you read about Christ, he was all about love. And he was incredibly intelligent, right? So how is it that people take this ideology of Christianity and morph it into something so evil, right? And why is Christianity even in our government buildings, right? This is coming from a Christian man, right? Jesus never ran for an office, right? He wasn't a part of a political party, right? How many times in his teaching did he tell people to go vote, right? That wasn't what his mission was. Yet we've made governmental obstruction, and not obstruction, oppression, almost a mantle of Christianity, and I think that's problematic. So I think Christians, and I'm only speaking about Christians because I'm a Christian, I think we have an onus to educate ourselves to be better Christians. And I think if we are actually Christians, then we don't have a question like this.
I imagine that each of you had a mentor when you were younger and growing up. Secretary, you mentioned some folks that in history that you thought were admirable models, but were there some personal mentors for you? that helped form the people that you are?
I'm embarrassed.
Please.
Rex will stand up. I literally am who I am as a professional because that man, for whatever reason, in a meeting, thought that I was worth taking a risk on. And he's helped me not only develop my law firm, but also develop my nonprofit. And we have very little in common, me and him, right? So that is what I consider leadership, right? And that is what I think civic organizations can do more, right? Bring in people who don't look like you, who don't think like you, who don't act like you, and then give them an opportunity.
I've had many mentors, but one kind of unexpectedly. In second, third, and fourth grade, I was in a program where half the class only spoke English, the other half only spoke Spanish, Mexican, and English-speaking folks, and we had a buddy. And for 3 years, we buddied up until we learned each other's languages, became friends, and we'd go over to each other's house, and my mentor, my buddy, was Alicia Perdoza, who came to my home, and we were blessed and had a lot of privilege. And we had a 4-bedroom home and horses and everything on our farm. And she came and we played, and we had a beautiful time. We fell in love as friends. And then she never invited me to her home. And I'd ask her in my limited Spanish, can I please come to your home? I want to be with your family. One day she took me, and it was a room about the size of this stage. And in the corner was a toilet with a curtain. Rolled mats were in back, and 38 people slept in her home. They were farm workers, and I, on the mat with them, lay that night crying for my ignorance about how much privilege that I had, and not knowing, not being aware. So she changed my life forever, and it's so much. Alicia lives in me as I do this work from day to day.
I would also say that my mentors, when I moved to the United States, most especially Ray Carlson, John Frickenbach, I can say that Ray Carlson, everywhere he went, so many people knew me. I don't even know them, but the word Sarah made a lot of noise to so many people, especially in the Rotary community. And through his mentorship, I got to know people like Dr. Gabby's, Hassan is sitting down here, even Drexel, and all these big names here. It's through Ray Carlson. Otherwise, who am I? Sometimes if I sit down, you know. But yes, mentors are very, very important. You know, we can mentor other people and cause them to bring up their, the skills in them. There are many people who have skills in them, but they just need somebody who can kind of push, that skill out from them. Thank you.
So for myself, it would start with my parents. They came here as refugees, and within one generation, their kid can get a PhD and teach at a university. So I think parents are kind of neat in that. I mentioned earlier about intergenerational exploitation. They're the opposite, right? Because they live for the future as opposed to when we live for ourselves and live for the present. So I think that's great. And then also I'd say my wife, I teach a lot on security, and if you look at most violence in international relations and history, it's always guys. It's young men who don't have opportunities in society or causes of instability. And I was one of those people. And I think since I met my partner over 10 years ago, just, you live for someone else and you learn that, and then, you learn to have a kid and things like that. But she's the person that chose me and I chose her, and I think that keeps me grounded. And so I learned a lot from having an equal or a better.
Mr. Secretary, I know that you're a son of Illinois, very, very proud of Lincoln's heritage there in your home state. I know you've done a great deal of work to promote that history and heritage. Is there a particular attribute of Lincoln's that you kind of took to heart as you advanced in your political career? What was it about him that inspired you?
Let me just say about mentoring what I said before. Each of you has an obligation. I know some of you have been good mentors. But you need to think about this. Who's going to follow on? In the job that you have, when you turn around and you're walking out the door, is there somebody that you can look at to say that I mentored them and they will carry on? This is important in the work that we do and important in the legacy that we leave. I think mentoring is one of the most important obligations we have as citizens. I think the thing about Lincoln that I love the most is that he hated slavery. He lost elections over it. He pursued the obliteration of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation is something that he pursued. If you look throughout his career, whether he was a state rep in the Illinois General Assembly, one-term congressman, I'm always very proud to say I represented the same congressional district that Abraham Lincoln represented. He had 9 counties, I had 20. But I think his pursuit of equality for all our citizens is the thing that is most enduring, and he was assassinated over it. When you look back and read about John Wilkes Booth and why he assassinated Lincoln, it was because Booth did not like the idea of the Emancipation Proclamation, of freeing the slaves. And, look at times, you think times are difficult now. Think about how difficult times were back then when the Civil War was going on. So many Americans were being killed. But Lincoln never gave up on the idea of freeing the slaves. Never gave up on the idea of the Emancipation Proclamation. Extraordinary American, and that's why he's considered the greatest president in the 240-year history of our country.
Let me follow up with a question I think all of you could take on, but Mr. Secretary, you're known for an ability to cross the aisle, to reach out to the other side, but without compromising on principles. How the heck does that work? In an era when even reaching across to the other side is considered a compromise on one's principles. How do you do that? And perhaps to our other speakers, how have you seen that done successfully?
I think you have to understand that our government is a government formed out of compromise. When you look at those men, I wish I could say men and women, but if you look at the men who wrote the Constitution, they were brilliant people. Not one of them got their own way. And think how long it took them to write the Constitution. But because of their ability to sit together in a room and work together and listen to one another and compromise with one another, we live in the greatest country in the world, bar none. And what withstands all of the 240 years of travail and controversy and all the things that have happened in those 240 years, what keeps us together and holds us together and makes America the greatest country is the Constitution. That's it. We have to live by it. And when you look at it from that point of view, then you understand that, again, men and women who run for office and want to get things done have to do it with the idea that not one of them is going to get their own way. If they want to prevail, they have to listen, they have to be respectful, and they have to compromise. And if you look at the big issues that our country has tackled in our 240 years, it was done with those three principles: listening to the other person, respect for their point of view even though you may not like it, and being willing to compromise, not your principles, but how do we get to the main issue, and how do we get it solved, and how do we do it in a way that reflects America's values. When people, I've been out of elective and public office now for 5 years in my local Rotary Club. When I was in Congress, every December I'd go to my local Rotary Club, of which I've been a member for 25 years, and I'd give them a report of what's been happening in politics and so forth. So this year, I got a call from a woman who I've known for many years in my hometown, a member of Rotary. She said, "The Rotary Club wants you to come back and tell us what the heck is going on and explain what's happening in America." And I said to Rebecca, now that my son's been elected to Congress and is serving, I've kind of shied away from that because he doesn't need me. That's his job now. He doesn't need me looking over his shoulder. But she said they want you to come, and so out of my respect for my Rotary Club and the members, who are all distinguished Peorians, I might say, in so many ways, I went back and we talked about what's happening in America today, the people that are in controls of the levers of government. But the final thing I said to them was, we will get through this. We always do, because we are subject to the rule of law and the greatest Constitution. That's what will bring us through this. That's what brought us through Watergate, through the Clinton impeachment, through the Iraq War, through 9/11. Think of all the things that we've all experienced in the last 5 decades. And we've come through it. And America's still a great country. It still offers people many, many opportunities. It's because of our Constitution. And think of the brilliance of the people that wrote it. I wish some of them had been women. I met a woman here who's a teacher. I don't know if she's still here. And she's the first woman, teacher, who I ever met that said that she went to Harvard. And I told her students, you know what you have here? Probably one of the smartest people in this room. When somebody goes to Harvard, that means they're pretty dang smart. And to think that, these students have a teacher who went to Harvard. I've been a teacher, and I've met a lot of teachers. I never met one that went to Harvard. What a great thing for these students to have somebody like that. Only in America.
For my research, I look at bargaining strategies. So I think a way to get to compromise or work across is to think about, to have a better understanding of time, right? So when you negotiate, it's purely based on context. So for instance, if you're two people are bargaining, they both, one person wants like $100 and another person doesn't want to give it, and that one person that wants the money is like drowning, and they're willing to compromise if they're going to take money or not, right? The context determines on how much they're willing to bargain, right? So the idea is to not treat every single bargaining as an end of the game, right? So you can improve the conditions so the next time you bargain, it gets easier because it's easier to move from one position to another depending on the current position you're at. So that's the one kind of way to look at it. And then secondly is that principles are guidelines or heuristics for our behavior in the world. They're not actually who we are, right? Like, we are what we do what we are, and what we aspire to be, right? So if we look at principles as just something that's absolute, that means we don't have a good understanding of time, because the assumption is that you're not going to change. So I think that should be kind of the overall strategy, to think of different processes. So in terms of reconciliation, that means even if you succeeded today, that means you should be willing to fail later and then reconcile and apologize in the future and continue that act, because it doesn't end at any single moment.
Thanks, Dr. Lee. We Rotarians do a lot of projects. We're also interested in promoting peace because it's one of our 6 avenues of service. How would you guide us in terms of measuring our success? Sometimes it's a little tough. You know, it can be kind of warm and fuzzy, and it's hard to assess the direct impact that we're having in the peace process. Any thoughts, suggestions, ideas?
I mean, I enjoy research, right? So if ever you're going to measure something, you have to operationalize it, right? Break it down into the various parts in which it can be measured. One of the programs that I think is pretty awesome that the West Covina Rotary does is they would go to Mexico and literally go to the village and build homes and wells and help that particular community. Well, that type of peace is measurable, right? And you can count the number of people who now have a home who previously did not have a home, the people who have clean water who did not previously, right? So there are ways to measure peace. We've heard it a few times that peace is freedom from want and freedom from violence, right? I think that's what it is.
From fear.
Fear, that's it.
Fear.
Right, freedom from fear and freedom from want, right? So, or need. So these things are things that can actually be measured because we know when people are afraid and when they are not. We know when people are in need or when they are not, or when they are not. So I think it's listening to the plight of these individuals and then operationalizing that particular issue into areas in which those particular aspects can be measured.
So get the voice of the customer in the process, figure out what people need, and then measure against those needs.
Exactly.
I would just also add to that. We know when we've had impact on someone's life, so of course getting the measurements and so forth, but we know in our hearts if we've made a difference. So I invite all of you to come to a challenge day in any school. We need your arms around the people, and you'll know that day when you see them in the beginning shy and scared, and then suddenly take the microphone and declare that they're a leader in changing what's going on in their school. You leave them going, I made a difference. So I would use both scientific research and your heart.
You know, when you're in politics, you measure your success by how many people voted for you in your elections, and whether your percentage was as high as the last election. I take it from the turnout here today that you've had a lot of success. I think you measure your turnout by the number of seats you filled, and you filled every seat today. And you filled it with a whole bunch of young people who probably won't be back the next time, but they will remember this time. And they'll encourage other students to come back. So I think you measure your success by all of these seats that were filled, and I would say you've been very, very successful, and keep on keeping on.
Thank you. Thank you. We have time for one last question, and I'll put it to each of you and give it some thought. What's the one thing that you would like each of us who are in the audience today to walk out and have in mind as an actionable step for peace? What would you like? And I know there are a lot of things, but give us your top thought about what we as Rotarians and guests here today can do in terms of an actionable step for peace.
I think we can embrace people who are the exact opposite of us, right? And I can tell you from personal experience, I smiled at several of you before the program started, and very few of those smiles were reciprocated, right? So when somebody is smiling and they're trying to embrace you, embrace back, right? And don't be afraid of listening. Just listen to somebody who doesn't think like you. ask questions with the intent of understanding them more, not to get judgment tools or to figure out the best response, right? But legitimately and genuinely embrace someone who is the exact opposite of you. Just do it once and just see what impact that has.
Thank you, thank you. Other thoughts?
I would say keep doing what you're doing. Service above self. Stay involved in the community. Participate in activities like this. And follow my advice. Don't forget to mentor someone.
All right. Okay. Dr. Lee.
I think, even though my talk was on the big, grand kind of peace agreements that people try to achieve, peace is actually really, there's an infinite amount of moments of peace in your interactions with family, friends. It's the day-to-day living that you don't have freedom of fear or want. So for myself, it's just to get to know people. So on your point, it's because I think fundamentally people are pretty cool, right? Like people are, like the more different they are, that's actually the cooler it is because it's enlightening, it's exciting, it's fun, and the things that you're very familiar with can get boring, right? So the more people you get to know, the more exciting it is, and the more enjoyable it is. And the joy and excitement, that's the daily piece that I think is the majority of our experience. And then there's the bigger things that we can mobilize for and vote and do things like that as well. But for most of it is your day-to-day interactions.
Okay, so for me, it's just to educate yourselves. You need to educate yourselves on the people that you are serving, in your communities. You need to learn to know more about them. Learning to know more about the people you are working with.
Thank you. Thank you. The last word.
The last word. Simplest thing and the hardest thing, according to what we learn and we know, put your phones away. Yeah. Have periods of the day, and especially peace starts in our hearts and our home. And if that's often where the technology, the TV goes on, the phones are on, and just put the screens away and look in each other's eyes, play, have fun. I already said the if you really knew me, and the challenge we give the teenagers around the world in the schools is to every day be part of the Be the Change movement, do at least one thing every day intentionally. Of all these ideas are shared or anything you can come up with to be in service. Small or big, every day.
I think all of us should thank Michael for an extraordinary job of emceeing today.